Hi everyone, and welcome to the plenary. This plenary is titled The Long Revolution of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Now, when we say clap for that. Now, just so we're all on the same page, when we say the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, y'all know who we're talking about, right? Also known as North Korea? Okay, just making sure. My name is Simon. I am a member of Nodutdol. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is among the least understood countries in the world. But its long history of socialist revolution is full of struggles, victories, and lessons that should inform our revolutionary work, both locally and internationally. The seeds of the Korean Revolution began sprouting during the Japanese occupation as the Korean people fought for sovereignty and national liberation on the peninsula, in Manchuria, in Japan, and on Jeju Island. After Japan's defeat, Korean communists escalated their work immediately to feed, defend, and educate their nation, founding the DPRK in 1948. Despite brutal US aggression through the Korean War, economic sanctions, and racist propaganda, the Korean Revolution continues as we speak. The Western bourgeois media twists the realities of ecological disasters and prudent defense policies to spew lies after lies about the DPRK, about how it's impoverished, misgoverned, and failing. What they don't mention is the fact that the DPRK remains under siege, legally at war with the largest military power in human history. They don't mention the fact that genocidal imperialist sanctions are killing thousands of Korean children. And they also don't mention the fact that the US spends about 560 times more on its defense budget than the DPRK. 560 times. They try to make us believe that the citizens of the DPRK are oppressed, brainwashed, waiting for the US to come save them. These lies objectify Koreans as obedient automatons devoid of agency. Well, they're not. They are our revolutionary comrades, full of love and power, creativity, tenacity, and tact. In our struggle for Korea's sovereignty and national liberation, it is urgent that we must develop razor-sharp analyses of the DPRK as a guiding light for the international socialist revolution. We will not pretend that the Korean Revolution has been perfect or easy. However, succumbing to imperialist lies will not enable us to analyze external conditions of US imperialism or internal contradictions of the DPRK. So with this urgency for truthful scientific knowledge of the DPRK, the purpose of this panel is twofold. And you can tell that Haruki is a professor because he developed learning objectives for this plenary. But first, we are here to prepare our movement to challenge US impunity in the event of escalation towards war in Korea. And secondly, we are here to win the battle of ideas being manufactured against those building socialism. In other words, we hope that this plenary will immediately equip you in advocating for the DPRK's fight against US imperialism. To achieve these goals, we are joined by three panelists who have some of the deepest insights into the DPRK's fight and socialist construction, based not only on research, but also first-hand experiences of visiting the country. First, we will hear from Betsy Loon. Betsy is a Nodutdol member and librarian. Betsy is a co-steward of Nodutdol's archives, has led 3 delegations to North Korea through Nodutdol's Korea Education and Exposure Program, or KEEP, and is a member of the Fight to Win Caucus and the International Committee of the Faculty and Staff Union of the City University of New York. She will speak on what we can learn from the DPRK's ongoing revolution based on both history and her personal experiences in the DPRK. Secondly, we will hear from Moe Taylor. Moe is a historian and community organizer based in Ottawa, Canada. He is the author of 2 books and numerous articles on DPRK Latin America relations, the role of the DPRK in global South solidarity, and issues of agriculture, farm mechanization, and food security on the Korean Peninsula. He will tell us about the DPRK's history of solidarity with Latin America and the global South, including Cuba. And finally, we have Brian Becker. Brian is the National Director of the Answer Coalition and the founding member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. He hosts a podcast and video show on Breakthrough News. And in 2001, he was the co-director of the International Tribunal on U.S. War Crimes in Korea, which presented testimony from survivors from South Korea, the DPRK, and overseas Koreans. He will share insights into the current conditions of the country and the ways towards peace. After hearing from these exciting panelists, I have the privilege of guiding a discussion with a few questions to draw out themes and connect back to broader struggles. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Betsy Loon.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for being here today. And I'd like to thank everyone who made this amazing conference possible. And I wanted to say that it's both a privilege and a breath of fresh air to be able to talk about North Korea with dedicated anti-imperialists who are committed to building a life-giving future. And as Simon mentioned, we know DPRK as North Korea and DPRK, and I'll just be using those 2 terms interchangeably. So we all know that mainstream narratives around the DPRK are oriented towards advancing imperialism. One such narrative recognizes North Korea's anti-colonial revolutionary past, but denies that this also characterizes its present. This is not true. I am going to discuss how North Korea's ongoing revolution shows up in its past and present through 2 themes. Number 1, its steadfast commitment to its people, and number 2, its clear-eyed embrace of the revolution as a long-term project. I apologize. In terms of the first theme, North Korea's commitment to its people, imperialism wants us to believe that the government of North Korea and the people of North Korea are completely distinct and fundamentally antagonistic. This lie facilitates any number of imperialist maneuvers, ranging from sanctions to conducting war drills, as it allows the imperialists to say that they are carrying out these actions on behalf of North Korea and against their government. We, of course, recognize that this is a lie. North Korea's steadfast commitment to its people is rooted in its recognition that the people are the backbone of the revolution. You lift up the people, and you lift up the revolution. North Korea's literacy efforts are a shining example of this. After liberation from Japanese colonialism in 1945 and Korea's unilateral division by the United States, the North carried out its literacy eradication campaign as part of what was called, quote, the most comprehensive reform program yet seen in the entire Third World. In 1945, as many as 90% of women were illiterate. By 1949, illiteracy had been eradicated. That's 4 years to eradicate and not just mitigate illiteracy for a population of 9.6 million people. Think of the logistics and determination involved in accomplishing this. To ensure that everyone, and not just most people, pass the literacy test. This unswerving commitment to lifting up its people and enfranchising everyone to participate in this tumultuous time of massive social change can be seen in the present day in the Grand People's Study Hall, pictured here. The Grand People's Study Hall is North Korea's central library, and when we visited it in 2011, we saw that it was much more than a place to keep and borrow books. We saw lecture halls filled with adult learners during the day engaged in continuing education. I emphasize the daytime because they were there to learn and then to bring their learnings back to their jobs. They weren't there because they had been made obsolete or redundant in their positions and needed to learn a new field of work, and they didn't have to engage in continuing education at night after the workday. They were there in their capacity as workers arranged through their workplaces. This kind of alignment between one's personal development and your identity as a worker is incredibly inspiring to me, especially coming from my experience as an academic librarian. Under capitalism, the most we can do in our individual roles is to try to inspire and motivate people to engage in such lifelong learning of their own accord and to persist in the face of barrier after barrier. In their illiteracy campaign and the Grand People's Study Hall, North Korea demonstrates the truth that these barriers are artificial. As we know, the material structures of society impact social relations. The structural commitment to cultivating the people and recognition of the fact that the people are the backbone of the revolution, apparent in the library's role as a space for educating workers, was likewise felt in everyday social relations. On our trips, we spent a lot of time with our guides and translators and developed deep relationships with them. And part of the territory is almost always some sort of exchange about our personal lives through stories and pictures. In 2009, our youth league guide was telling us how he met his wife and of their courtship. And one of us asked how he ended up proposing. And he responded, "I asked her, 'Will you walk the revolutionary road with me?'" Yes. And I told someone else earlier, this was not a sentimental person. He'd make fun of us when we cried on the trip and stuff. So just to give you a sense of his personality. So through cultivating a revolutionary population, everyday social relations become imbued with a sense of how they relate to the larger revolutionary project. Yes, everyday social relations. The revolution is not something you do during the day and escape from at home, but is instead woven into the fabric of society. Love is part of the revolution. Our second theme, the long-term and ongoing nature of the revolution, is deeply connected to the first, the people who are the backbone of the revolution. So after the devastation of the Korean War, North Korea had to rebuild. To highlight the scale of destruction, the bombing of North Korea was so extensive, it was the equivalent of more than 4 Hiroshima A bombs worth of ordnance that was dropped on North Korea. And afterwards, a US general commented that there were no more targets in Korea. So they had a massive project ahead of them. In rebuilding, North Korea oriented both their domestic production and their imports toward heavy industry over light industry. Heavy industry refers to things like shipbuilding, steel making, large-scale systems that are not oriented towards public consumption, but instead are oriented toward building infrastructure. This was not an easy decision, nor was it foregone. There was intense debate inside North Korea at the time, as well as pressure from the DPRK's trading partners to address serious shortages through light industry. Light industry is things like consumer goods, textiles, and so on. It would have been a far easier solution to address immediate shortages with immediate solutions, but North Korea took a long-term view. They recognized that the mechanisms of subjugation under imperialism, and despite the existence of a socialist trading bloc, they saw that short-term and immediate deprivation was required in order to be sustainable in the long term. An economist from North Korea said of that period, "When we make more farming machines, we produce more rice. When we make building equipment, we produce many more houses. And with vessels, we can catch more fish." There was a collective decision made at the time to sacrifice immediate needs in order to build the necessary foundation for independent development. Another example of long-term thinking from more recent years is the DPRK's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. They were the first to close their borders to international travel and curtailed nearly all trade with China, their main trading partner. The North Korean commentariat saw this as an overreaction, believing that the trade-offs of incurring economic losses to keep the pandemic at bay was an irrational decision. However, in reality, the DPRK's strong measures in this regard were a recognition of the material reality that they were facing. Such drastic measures were necessary in order to protect the people. This is, again, an expression of the long-term view over short-term gains and the willingness to make short-term sacrifices, in this case, economic loss, for long-term gains, in this case, a healthy population. Again, if you protect the people, you protect the revolution. The DPRK also demonstrates long-term thinking through its commitment to documenting and narrating the revolution. Everyday sites of production, such as factories and farms, activated both the past and the future through the display of archival materials and photos to commemorate when these sites were first established, notable visits or commendations from leadership, and the contribution of the facility to the nation-building project. This is one such display at a food factory where they show the foodstuffs that they produce and the labels that they made. This practice, in combination with the museums and historical sites we visited, points to a deliberate and political approach to memory production. The past and the future were dialectically embedded within the present, such that everyday people felt empowered to participate in building the future. This board is at a towel factory, and it talks about the contribution of the factory during the hard time of the arduous march. And so these sites and archives, they articulated North Korea's people-centered history and political direction, and they contribute to a collective understanding of the past, present, and future of the Korean people. So what I take away from these two themes, again, the people are the backbone of the revolution, and the revolution is a long-term project, is that first, we need to embody the revolution in our lives. And second, we need to be engaged in long-term thinking and laying the necessary foundations for change. Let's all recognize our material conditions and engage with the reality of our circumstances as revolutionaries in the imperial core, without once losing sight of the fact that we are putting forth a positive vision that we will realize with our collective will. This means mobilization. This means people power and love. This means organization. This means structure. This means long-term planning. This means balancing the needs and urgency of the current moment with what it takes to realize a revolutionary future. It also means that we need to properly record, archive, and narrate our struggle in order to ensure that the lessons we learn are of use. We are working to build a society that prioritizes people, life, and flourishing over profit, capital, and artificial scarcity. And finally, I want to conclude by reaffirming the fact that our material conditions determine our consciousness. We are fighting for a different future, but that doesn't mean we are somehow exempt from the constant ideological onslaught that we are immersed in here from birth to death. We need solid grounding in revolutionary theory, and we also need regular engagement with societies that are not organized around capital. To share one example of why this is important, in 2013, we were visiting a food production factory, and our hosts were showing us the control room for their CNC machines, seen here. CNC stands for Computer Numerical Control, and the host was proudly describing how these CNC machines help them to automate certain tasks. Our immediate reaction, living here, was concern. Of course, here under capitalism, automation is a harbinger of worker precarity. So we asked, what happens to the workers whose jobs are automated? And well, our hosts were confused by this question. What do you mean, what happens to the workers? And eventually, after some back and forth, they clarified that the workers did not in fact lose their jobs. They were still working and employed in the factory. For them, automation was something that enabled them to improve productivity for the benefit of society rather than profit margins, and therefore did not entail dumping workers to save money, to the extent that they did not even understand what we were asking. And their confusion would probably be interpreted by non-anti-imperialists as being secretive about what happens to workers whose jobs are automated. So what kind of society takes advances in production such as automation and uses it to spread misery and disenfranchisement? Our mutual confusion over the question of workers and automation is a crystallization of how capitalism strangles our ability to envision alternatives even when we are fighting against it. If we are to build a new society out of the ashes of capitalism, we need to materially experience and learn from societies that have already done so. And yet, Nodutdol's last trip to North Korea was in 2015. In 2017, the US government instituted a ban on travel to North Korea, and we haven't been back in 10 years. This travel ban, in addition to functioning as a form of sanction on North Korea, is a way to prevent people from engaging with the reality of North Korea and prevent North Koreans from speaking for and representing themselves. We need to travel to North Korea and build relationships and connections, and we need to recognize and internalize the lessons of North Korea's ongoing revolution. We need to speak widely and prolifically and pierce the lies that constitute the popular understanding of North Korea as a state that terrorizes its people and the world. Concurrently, we need to engage in positive organizing and long-term thinking, rooted in rigorous anti-imperialist analysis, building structures that reflect our current conditions and that will move us along our path most effectively and strategically. Lenin said that we are fighting better than our fathers did. Our children will fight better than we do, and they will be victorious. Let's make it happen together.
I have only visited the DPRK once. That was in 2018. I'd actually previously met North Koreans who lived and worked in Central America, but through these relationships I developed and some work I have done as a historian, I received an invitation to visit in 2018, which was an incredible experience, but that's actually not what I'm here to talk about today. I'm in fact going to be talking a bit about the history of friendship and solidarity between the DPRK and Latin America and the Caribbean. How this history helps us better understand the DPRK and maybe some lessons we can take away from this history. So the first major phase of North Korean engagement with Latin America and the Caribbean comes with the Cuban Revolution of 1959. The North Korean leadership really saw this event as having major historical importance, not just because it was a small, underdeveloped, ex-colonial country 90 miles from the United States carrying out a successful revolution. Right under the nose of the US imperialists is how the North Koreans used to like to describe it in the 1960s, but also because of the impact it had. The Cuban Revolution inspired revolutionary movements in virtually every country in Latin America and the Caribbean. And there was a broader context here, which is that in the eyes of many around the world, but certainly the North Korean and Cuban leadership, the 1960s and events like the Cuban Revolution appeared to signal that the focus of revolutionary struggle in the world had really shifted to the global South. In addition to what was happening in Latin America and the Caribbean, there were militant anti-colonial struggles across Africa, multiple communist-led insurgencies in Southeast Asia. The two biggest communist parties in the world were in Indonesia and India, and there was a revolution in the south of Yemen, which is often forgot today, but was very much being paid close attention to by leftists in the global south in the 1960s. At the same time as this is happening, the US government is intervening, sometimes directly, sometimes covertly, militarily, all over the global south, to crush revolutionary movements, to prevent even moderately left-wing governments from taking power, to overthrow governments in power. Of course, the most familiar example to us all is Vietnam, but Guyana, the Dominican Republic, the Congo, Guatemala, the examples are endless. So in this context, both the Cuban and North Korean leaderships develop an analysis of the international situation and come to the conclusion that the primary goal of the international communist movements and the international left more broadly must be the defeat of US imperialism before all else. The strategy that they developed to meet this goal was the proliferation, the expansion of armed struggle in the global south. Why? Well, what the DPRK and Cuban leadership argued is that US strategy was essentially numerical superiority and force concentration. Again, to use the example of Vietnam, it's a small, poor country in Southeast Asia, and the US unleashed the largest aerial bombardment campaign in human history on it in the 1960s. The DPRK answer to this situation was the same as Che Guevara's, when he famously said, "Creamos dos, tres, muchos Vietnams." Let us create 2, 3, many Vietnams. The logic here was that what the United States was doing in Vietnam, it could not do everywhere. And if armed struggle grew throughout the global south, US military forces would be stretched thin, and this would break its capacity to intervene on this scale in this way. So this was the context in which Cuba and the DPRK developed exceptionally close relations in the 1960s. Che visited the country in 1960. The DPRK provided substantial economic and technical assistance to aid Cuba's development goals, to counteract the impact of the US embargo. And both Cuba and the DPRK collaborated in supporting revolutionary movements all over Latin America. They also both sent volunteers to Vietnam. The other aspect of this means that the DPRK really didn't prioritize state-to-state relations in Latin America and the Caribbean in the 1960s. They saw most of the existing nominally independent governments as neo-colonial vassal states of US empire. So for the DPRK, beyond Cuba, its priority was not having diplomatic relations or commercial ties with these governments. It was supporting the revolutionary movements in these countries. The 1970s is a new chapter in DPRK relations with Latin America and the Caribbean. And the reason why is because there are major changes in the international geopolitical landscape that inspire pretty substantial shifts in DPRK foreign policy. And in particular, what we see is a move away from what was a very militant line in the 1960s, which some accused of being an ultra-left line, to a foreign policy strategy that was more focused on multilateralism, on peaceful diplomacy, and on state-state relations. So what brought around this shift? Well, by the end of the 1960s and early 1970s, many of the Cuban-inspired armed revolutionary movements in the region had been defeated or seriously weakened in the course of large-scale, brutal, US-funded counterinsurgency operations. And so in this context, this idea that Cuba and the DPRK had championed in the 1960s, that armed struggle would only grow and spread, and that this was the way forward, it lost some credibility by the early 1970s. At the same time, the 70s was also the rise and really the peak of the non-aligned movement. So for those of you, I'm sure many of you are familiar, the non-aligned movement was founded in 1961 as a coalition of small and developing and ex-colonial states asserting their right to stay independent of the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, By the 1970s, it had really grown in membership and strength to an extent that it was able to really challenge the status quo of international relations that had prevailed since the end of the Second World War. Its program had solidified around decolonization, support for national liberation struggles, anti-apartheid struggles, particularly in Africa, nuclear disarmament, and a more just global economic system, with the non-aligned movement called the New International Economic Order, or NIEO. And symbolic of the power the non-aligned movement acquired in this period, they successfully had the United Nations endorse the NIEO project in 1974. The DPRK really takes inspiration from this moment. It sees this rising non-aligned third world coalition as being very important and changing the international landscape. In this context, the DPRK develops an analysis of the international situation, which is that the primary contradiction, so to speak, in the world has become not that between the socialist and the capitalist camps, not the conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but rather a conflict between a universal yearning for national autonomy versus imperialism. And essentially, the DPRK leadership argues that at least in the global south, the question of socialism, the class struggle can be put aside while we wage this immediate struggle led by the non-aligned movement for a new international order premised on principles of sovereignty, independence, and non-interference. So in line with this, we see a shift in DPRK foreign policy away from supporting revolutionary movements from below, and a greater focus on building constructive relationships with governments in the global south, largely across the ideological spectrum, not without exceptions. The DPRK becomes an outspoken advocate of non-alignment and third world solidarity, and in particular, the concept of South-South cooperation. South-South cooperation, as defined by the DPRK leadership, is merely the principle that developing countries can overcome what they may lack individually in terms of technology and resources by pooling their resources together, by cooperating and trading amongst themselves on a fraternal basis in a spirit of solidarity. And the DPRK's greatest contribution to this project of South-South cooperation was its tractors. The DPRK has produced a very cool little 28 horsepower tractor, mass-produced these since the late 1950s. And in the 70s and 80s, the DPRK actually gifted thousands of these tractors to its new friends in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, etc. Essentially, what we see in the 1970s is the DPRK really turn its focus to very practical projects of South-South cooperation aimed at development, at resource sovereignty, really focused on this idea that developing countries can, for the time moment, put ideological differences aside and find common cause in this union of a more just international order, a more just economic system, a more just system of global trade. I think just as a way of kind of wrapping up, there's a lot of lessons we can take away from this, but I think in particular it reminds us that the DPRK is not a monolith. The DPRK is always changing. The DPRK of today is not the same place it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And of course, this would not be controversial to say about any other country in the world, but we do have to counter the opposite narrative when we speak of the DPRK, unfortunately. The DPRK, like any country, has its internal contradictions. There are inevitably differences of opinion, conflicts of interest within the party, within what we might call the ruling stratum. The DPRK's trajectory is not set in stone. The leadership is faced with decisions, it's faced with options, and what options it pursues, both in the immediate and in terms of long-term strategy, will inevitably be shaped by external threats and external opportunities. So I think that's about my time, so I'm going to leave it there, and thank you very much.
Thank you. I think those were really fascinating talks covering far different topics. And if we had a day or 2 days or a week or longer to talk about the DPRK and its evolution since 1948 or since 1945, we would be able to exhaustively try to piece together a comprehensive understanding of a complex social and political organism. One of the problems that we face in the United States is the nonstop demonization and caricaturing of the DPRK, so that if you say anything like, let's end the Korean War and have a peace treaty, the US government will say, well, look, you're echoing DPRK talking points. You must be an agent of the DPRK. Are you registered with the Justice Department as a foreign agent? I'm not saying that sort of hyperbolically. That's actually what's happening right now. Even this conference is being smeared by right-wing anti-communist media. And by right-wing, I would include CNN, MSNBC, and all of the Democratic Party aligned media. But the reality is that the DPRK is a complex political and social organism. And I think I really like the fact that you, Mo, talked about Cuba and North Korea. And, I was just thinking as I was listening to you, today is July 26th. And July 26th, for those who don't know, 1953 was the day that Fidel, leading a small group of people, stormed the Moncada fortress and began what became the victorious Cuban Revolution. That was today in 1953. And the very next day, July 27th, 1953, the very next day, there is an armistice agreement signed between the DPRK and the other belligerents, including the US, to bring the military conflict that we call the Korean War to an end. So within 24 hours, the Cuban Revolution begins, and an armistice agreement is signed, and that armistice agreement represented the recognition by the US that they had lost the war in Korea because their goal was to extinguish the DPRK, and instead they were suing for peace at that moment. Now, there's one important fact about the armistice agreement in 1953 that I want to bring to everyone's attention, is that in May 1953, according to documents that were released 30 years later, the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Pentagon, all of them, unanimously agreed that they would begin dropping nuclear bombs on North Korea and on China unless both sides came and signed an armistice agreement. I'm quite sure that the perspective of Kim Il-sung and the revolutionary forces in the DPRK was to fight and fight and fight as the Vietnamese fought and fought and fought until the entire country was unified. But this enormous pressure was applied where China, which had just succeeded with its own revolution, it was less than 4 years old, was being threatened with nuclear annihilation unless they and the DPRK forces signed the armistice agreement. And we don't know what happened behind the scenes, but undoubtedly there was great pressure on Kim Il-sung and the leadership in the DPRK to come to the table and to sign that armistice agreement. If there had been no armistice agreement, and of course, in one way, stopping the bombing, stopping the killing, stopping the death, stopping the destruction, what could be more important in one way? But the Koreans could look a decade later to the Vietnamese who likewise had decided that they would fight and fight and fight and never stop fighting. And ultimately, the US had to leave Vietnam. And Vietnam was reunited, and Vietnam is united today. And the fact of the matter is that the US was not only losing the Korean War, but it would have completely lost the Korean War because the goal of every American soldier was to come home. And the fact of the matter is every member of the DPRK and Revolutionary Guerrilla Fighting Force in Korea, they were home. They weren't going anywhere. Just like the Vietnamese, they were going to fight and stay home until the foreign invaders were driven out. And so we have, as a consequence of this armistice agreement, the dialectic. The fighting ended, which was amazingly important because so many Koreans died. We talk about the genocide in Gaza, and it is a genocide. The Korean War was a genocide. 4 million Koreans died, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the 1967 edition. 4 million died who would not have otherwise died. That's a genocide, given the size of both North and South Korea at that time. Cuba and the DPRK are linked, as Moe pointed out, and I think it's really important to recognize this as we're trying to have both a partisan but at the same time objective assessment of the situation. Cuba and the DPRK were part of a wave of revolution that was sweeping the world starting in 1945. The colonial empires had been weakened by the magnitude of the violence in World War II. 80 million, 90 million people died. Britain, France, all of the European colonizers and the Japanese had been weakened by the war, and suddenly the space opened for all of those who had been subjected to colonization, the racist domination of their people, their country, their land, their resources. And all around the world, from Latin America to the Middle East to Africa to Asia, the colonized were rising up. Korea, DPRK, and Cuba represented that sector of the national liberation movements that were not only fighting for national independence, not only fighting for sovereignty, but also fighting for socialism. And as a consequence of this merger between national self-determination and socialism, both countries became targeted by imperialism, by the new hegemon, US imperialism, which decided to declare war a nonstop war, a war that has never ended against both. Cuba and DPRK are very different, and yet they have that in common. They are countries of what we call today the global south, what was called the third world, what was called the colonized world, who rose up, demanded freedom, fought with guns in hand to win that freedom, but also recognized that real freedom, not simply formal equality, required that their country take a socialist path so that the land, labor, and resources could be completely independent from imperialism. It had to come under the control of the working class and the poor peasantry, led by their own parties, their own Marxist organizations. And so there was that wave of revolution from 1945, and I would say we could see, as Moe pointed out, it starts to wane in some degree in the 70s, but by the 1980s, with the Sino-Soviet split, and then finally the toppling of the Soviet government, the overthrow of the socialist governments of Eastern and Central Europe, the wave of revolution gives way to a wave of counter-revolution. And I would say that, to Moe's point, the adjustments in the DPRK's foreign policy are a reflection that it's living in a different political environment. The environment where counter-revolution, rather than revolution, dominates the global political environment. This era of counter-revolution has not ended, but I believe it is ending. I believe that we will see an end to it, and hopefully people in the United States can help expedite the end of the era of counter-revolution by carrying out our own profound social transformation, because what happens here in the belly of the beast, in the center of imperialism, would make all the difference in the world for the people yearning to breathe free, for those yearning to take the socialist path. I want to talk about how the DPRK has functioned inside this era of counter-revolution, somewhat similar to the other comments of Moe. And Betsy's point is also, and points are so important, because even in this era, the DPRK, through its own innovations, its own creativity, in addition to having to deal in a very hostile international environment, the DPRK went from having been almost destroyed as a consequence of the tremendous famine that did exist. It was real. I was there. I've been to DPRK multiple times. I was there in 1989, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and later. It was the terrible situation in the DPRK. But that has improved greatly over the years, and as a consequence of the leadership of the DPRK navigating these very, very troubled waters internationally. But I want to, in my last now 2 minutes, talk about what does the DPRK want and what should we think about what they want. I think when Trump met with Kim Jong-un in Singapore and then in Hanoi, it was quite clear what the DPRK was doing, and they've done this over and over and over again. They said to the United States, we're willing to come to an agreement. And the agreement is this. The agreement is, and you can read the Singapore summit. There's 4 points, very short. Read the Singapore summit. It's not about denuclearization, number one. Number one, the DPRK and the US signed an agreement that said, based on the desire of the people of both countries, we will begin the normalization of relations so that we can have peace between the United States and Korea. Number two, that there will be the creation of a permanent peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. And number three was a commitment to work towards denuclearization. Now, this commitment was number 3, not number 1. Number 1 was peace. Number 1 was normalization. Number 1 was end the war that the armistice only militarily ended but didn't really end the war. So point number 1. The other part of that agreement is we are only going to deal with the United States if you treat us as equals. We are not your subordinates. We are not under your heel. We will not be treated like that. We will have normal relations based on mutual respect and equality. And also, I think it made it quite clear, the DPRK is a nuclear power, and that's not going to change, because without nuclear weapons, the DPRK has come to the conclusion that what happened to Iraq in 2003 would be the fate of the DPRK, and under no circumstances, given the history of this country and this leadership, stable through 3 or 4 generations, will the DPRK disarm itself in the face of aggression by the biggest military power in the world. And so, there was an insistence that the DPRK not only has an agreement with the United States, but its core element of self-defense will never be surrendered. And I think that's really important for people here. I think in our discussion, we're going to talk about what does our movement do about the DPRK. One, we have to tell the truth like Betsy is telling us, and that's why the US doesn't want people to go to Korea, because they don't want people to see for themselves what life is like in the DPRK. Secondly, we have to be able to fight against the caricaturing, the demonization, the stereotyping. And third, we have to say to the people in the United States, the real danger of nuclear war in the world is not the DPRK, whose national budget is equivalent to the police department budget of New York City. The real threat to peace is US imperialism, which has 5,000 operational nuclear weapons, spends $1 trillion each and every year to make more weapons of mass destruction, and that will only change when we, the people of the United States, say we've had enough. To do it's going to be hard. It's going to be a big struggle, but we can do it. Thank you.
So I have a few questions for our panelists. The first one I did want to direct towards Brian. Maybe you can consider it an extension of your time. It seemed like you had some more things you wanted to say. But I'm wondering if you could talk more about, you mentioned this shift in North Korea's policies, its stance, that it now considers its nuclear power, its nuclear armaments to be non-negotiable. Similarly, it has now shifted in its stance on reunification, right? North Korea was once a leading force in pushing for peaceful reunification on the peninsula, and now it no longer considers it to be a viable path moving forward. And it also considers the US and South Korea to be its principal enemy. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the historical context behind these shifts in policies, and also if you could also talk to, in the context of these shifts, why it's essential for anti-imperialists in the US to continue to fight and advocate for the DPRK's fight against US imperialism.
Sure. I think that we've seen at different times that the obstacle to a peaceful resolution of the Korean conflict, even allowing for 2 different entities to exist, the ROK and the DPRK, that there was considerable progress made at different points in the last 35 years. I'll mention one. In 1994, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the US really felt, okay, Eastern European socialist governments, we destroyed them, or they destroyed themselves, or both. The Soviet Union is gone. Now we can get North Korea. And now we can get Cuba. And there was almost a war, which people don't know about, in 1994 between the US and the DPRK. And Jimmy Carter went to North Korea and he met with Kim Il-sung, and there was an agreement. It was called the General Framework Agreement, whereby North Korea promised not to keep enriching producing plutonium, not to have nuclear weapons, and in exchange, the US would build 2 light water reactors that could not produce plutonium but could provide nuclear energy for civilian purposes. And so there was an agreement, a near war ending with an agreement. And then at the end of the 1990s, the North Koreans realized the US hadn't dug 1 inch into the soil to build these nuclear reactors. And so the North Koreans started to take a more militant position in relationship to nuclear weapons, and immediately Bill Clinton signaled that they were ready for negotiations with North Korea. And Madeleine Albright, the then Secretary of State, actually went to Pyongyang. She negotiated with the North Korean leadership. It looked like normalization was about to happen. And then George W. Bush, this was right at the end of the Clinton administration, George W. Bush came in, and immediately when he invited the South Korean president to come to the White House in March 2001, treated him rudely, denounced the Sunshine Policy, which was the policy of rapprochement, of détente between the North and the South, by the South Korean liberal government at that time. And Bush, a few months later, declared that North Korea, Iran, and Iraq were an axis of evil, at which point the North Koreans said, okay, we're done with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They left the NPT, which was their right, and they began building nuclear weapons and became a nuclear power. Now, during this entire period, the United States demonized the North Koreans for becoming a nuclear menace. The American people don't know that the North Koreans were the ones suggesting a path forward whereby they would not have nuclear weapons in exchange for peace, in exchange for normal relations with the United States. But absent that, they were not going to disarm themselves. So what do? We have to tell the truth about this. The American people don't know any of this. I mean, I think probably some of us in the room might not know some of this history, because it's not discussed. It's not part of our education. But it's all part of the record. And so I think a massive public education campaign for the broad U.S. public about the reality and history of the U.S. DPRK relations would be very beneficial. Final point, the U.S. went to war against Vietnam. Millions of Vietnamese died. Tens of thousands of Americans died. The U.S. has normal relations with Vietnam today. Why can't it have normal relations with the DPRK? Why can't it have just normal, regular relations with the DPRK? There is an ideological consideration, but also, and this is, I think, the most important and final point, the U.S. is getting ready for war with China. And so to that extent, having confrontation with North Korea is a pretext. It's pretextually useful to paint North Korea as a great menace, to pump all of those U.S. Aircraft carriers and destroyers and fighter jets into the Pacific as the U.S. prepares for this major global war, which is insanity, but yet they're preparing for it. So for people who care about peace, for people who don't want World War III, we have to educate them about the significance of U.S. policy towards North Korea, because it's part and parcel of getting ready for World War III.
Hello? Yeah. I think this is a point that we often bring up in the events that we organize, is that in terms of the spectrum that we should have in terms of our perspective of North Korea, the lowest end of the spectrum should really be that everyone views North Korea as a logical, rational actor. And that's nowhere close to where public consciousness is with regards to North Korea, right? Every time news comes up of like North Korea very, rationally and logically, after decades of attempted diplomacy and failed promises on the the side of the U.S., they back out from negotiations, or they declare themselves to be like, okay, you're not engaging with us, so now this is non-negotiable. The U.S. media latches onto that and adds to this narrative that, look, the DPRK are a bunch of irrational, war-hungry demons, and they deserve to be slaughtered. And that then manufactures consent for ongoing militarization of South Korea to point towards China, right? So thank you, Brian, for adding clarity and context to that. I'm wondering if our other panelists would like to address that question as well.
I just wanted to add that not only did the US have no intention of following through on the light water reactor promise, but they were actively waiting, they were actively banking on the fact that North Korea was in a precarious situation at the time, and were hoping for its collapse. So they never had any intention of engaging in these agreements in good faith at all.
The question is, what has the DPRK's resistance taught other movements about survival, dignity, and sovereignty, and what can it continue to teach?
Yeah, so one of the places that was there, the big steel, I don't know the terminology, that big steel oven, at that factory they make juche steel. Do people know what juche means? I hear some yeses. So juche is self-reliance, and juche steel means that it is steel that they can manufacture in the country without having to rely on imports. And the reason that this is an important ability is because North Korea is one of the most sanctioned countries out there and has been under sanction since its founding, under different entities. And so it doesn't only apply to steel. They have this textile called vinylon. And you might see in North Korea, in photos of North Koreans, a lot of the people are wearing like a very similar type looking fabric. And the assumption on the part of a lot of people who aren't familiar is that, oh, these are government officials, this is some sort of uniform, but actually it's vinylon fabric that's created, able to be created totally domestically without relying on imports. And I think it's interesting that like this symbol of like resilience and survival is interpreted in photos around in the West as like, oh, all these government officials are wearing the same uniform, and these government officials are the ones that we have deemed evil and are oppressing the true North Koreans, who are definitely not these people. So North Korea is full of little adaptations and large-scale adaptations like this. The fabrics, the steel. Also, I'm sorry, I shared this in my workshop yesterday, but the traffic controllers who sit there guiding traffic, are people familiar with the traffic controllers? They're very iconic, they're pictured a lot, and I was really interested in them because to me, they demonstrated a level of creativity and adaptation to a huge problem, which is a lack of reliable electricity. And in the context of a lack of reliable electricity, you can't have working streetlights without the danger of something happening at any moment. And so they implemented this role that is part of the public safety officer group of people. And then they persisted carrying out their everyday duties and surviving within the constraints that, as Moe has pointed out, exist internationally that ultimately really constrain the ways in which they can move forward in certain ways. And so this is another reason why it's important to go and visit, because you can see the way in which these small adaptations and these little creativities come to life. Another small anecdote is at their subway stations and other public areas, they have these newspaper kiosks. So, they might not have the capacity to have like massive newspaper distribution and that goes to every single person in the country, but they want to have an informed populace. And so they have these stands at the station where you can, while you're waiting for your train, just read that day's news, and you do it next to people, you do it collectively. And in the face of paper shortages and things like that, they found a way to still make create a way for their populace to be engaged and informed and have a stake in what they're doing and what's going on in the country. And those are like very small adaptations, but they're also very moving to me when I see them.
Yeah, maybe just picking up on this theme of what we can learn from this history. You know, I never time my talks right, and I didn't really get to wrap up what happens next from when the DPRK embraced the non-aligned movement with such enthusiasm in the 1970s. Well, the DPRK never stopped embracing the non-aligned movement or the concept of third world solidarity or South-South solidarity, we might say today. It is still a very active member of the non-aligned movement. What did change is the non-aligned movement and the geopolitical situation. The non-aligned movement really went into decline in the early 1980s for a variety of reasons that we don't have time to get into. But one I will touch upon is the non-aligned movement's own internal contradictions. There were many members of the non-aligned movement that represented essentially third world elites who, including some quite reactionary regimes who perhaps were against colonialism, against apartheid, were all for nuclear non-proliferation, but really were not committed to these principles of South-South cooperation or South-South solidarity in the way a country like the DPRK was. And they certainly were not committed to challenging US hegemony in a way, the way a country like the DPRK was. And I actually think we see parallels of that situation today. There are no shortage of elites in the global South who are happy to cynically use the language of decolonization and even anti-imperialism. I think for those of us on the left, we need to guard against a kind of vulgar anti-imperialism that can confuse form with content, that is too quick to take certain elite actors at their word. Sort of elite-driven, state-centric projects of South-South solidarity. That's not to say they might not have progressive elements. It's not to say they might not have goals or initiatives worth supporting, but at the end of the day, it's no substitute for building a working class, a workers' movement, a working class left that can actually influence politics on a national level. Thanks.
Thank you all. Yeah, I guess just looking at the time, I did want to turn it over to each of you to see if you had any closing statements that you'd like to offer to the audience. One theme that you could potentially touch on is that you've already kind of mentioned, each of you, but what is the core political task for anti-imperialists related to the DPRK? But if there are other things you'd like to address as well, please feel free to do so. Maybe we could go with the original order.
Yeah. So the core task, I think, is, the public discourse, we are in a moment of crisis right now. There's a lot of shit happening everywhere. There's horrible things happening. And yet, it's essential that we don't lose sight of the fact that we need to build a long-term plan. We need to address and put out fires as they come up, but we can't do that at the expense of building towards something in the future. I feel like I hear a lot about, we can't do this yet because there's this crisis, there's that crisis. And, if the DPRK can survive under sanctions and still, come up with a rural development plan, I feel like we, as those who are living here in the Imperial Core, can put our heads together and figure out how to creatively apply our Juche spirit and figure out how to both handle the crises of the immediate moment that they're throwing at us left and right, while also never forgetting that we need to build what the necessary structures and all the boring logistical stuff that we will need to create for our futures. When when Japanese colonialism ended, as soon on April 15th, 1945, there was a proliferation of organizing on the Korean Peninsula, and that didn't happen out of nowhere. That was decades and decades of organizing under colonialism for a future that they didn't know when would come. But when it came, they were ready. And so we need to be ready, we need to be organized, and we need to plan effectively and be strategic and not let them overwhelm us with all the stuff that they're throwing at us.
I guess I would just add that for those of us in whatever country we might live in who are advocating and pushing for a sensible, for the governments in the countries where we live to have a sensible policy on the DPRK, I think a step in that direction is countering disinformation, in countering the dehumanization of North Koreans. I think an important tool in that can be actually cultural and scientific cooperation, which many countries around the world have with the DPRK. If you look at the example of Brazil, which has had decades of positive and constructive diplomatic relations with the DPRK, one of the main outgrowths of that relationship, one of the main things that the North Koreans have asked for out of that relationship is collaboration in soybean production. For most people who enjoy stories about terrorism and nuclear bombs and crypto theft or whatever, that seems quite boring, but it reminds people that this is just a country that wants to have normal relations with the rest of the world so we can do stuff like scientific cooperation in soybean production. So I think cultural sports, scientific cooperation is a good way towards countering the dehumanization of the DPRK and changing people's perceptions. But of course, as I think most of us know, there are limits to education, to unlearning, etc. At the end of the day, we can't, there's limits to what we can expect from government, and so it takes us back to the original task of building a working class movement that can impact politics on a national level, and there's just no substitute for that. Okay, thank you.
Well, not to be too redundant, but I agree with both of them. I think that, as Betsy pointed out, the bottom line for any movement is, are we organized? And you can't be organized without organization. And as complicated and as hard as organization is, and I'm fully aware of all of that, it's the number one priority. If you're here and you're not in Nodutdol and you think this conference is great, you should try to organize inside of Nodutdol and build it. Because look at how effective this event is. That's because there was an organization. It can't happen without organization. And as Betsy also pointed out, 99% of organization is not people speaking at a microphone. 99% of organization is all of the other tasks, which are kind of quiet, sort of, not fully paid attention to, but are the essence of every movement. And also, we have to become good at organizing. We should become professional organizers, in the sense, not that because if the right wing hears me, they'll say, oh, see, George Soros is paying everybody to be a professional protester. I mean, like, more in the Leninist concept of the professional revolutionary. And by that, you have to get training. If you want to be a biologist, you can't say, I am a biologist. That requires study and training. Like any profession requires a lot of training. And in order to become really good at organizing, which is the essence of movement building, we have to train ourselves, we have to learn together. But the organization is, in fact, everything. The movements will go up and down. There will be ebbs and flows. Sometimes you can have like massive numbers of people and everybody thinks, wow, this is great, I want to be part of this. But then that movement will go down and people think, oh, we didn't succeed, what was it all about? We're disappointed, we're demoralized. But the organization is the essence of movement building, because between the ebb and the flow, you need a vessel of memory that's learned the lessons of what just came. A lesson that can be generalized. Theory is the generalization of experience. And so the theorizing of organization is the essence of organization. And so I think the most important thing is if you're not in an organization, join it, help it grow strong, become more trained yourself. And it's a collective effort. We are a collective. There is no such thing as an indispensable person, but our organizations are indispensable.
I have to say I agree with Brian about his assessment of Nodutdol. I too think it's an amazing organization. But yeah, can we give it up for our panelists one more time? And I think to Betsy's point too about how after decades of colonialism, like as soon as Japanese colonialism was ended through the end of World War II, people's committees, right, sprouted throughout all of the Korean Peninsula, and those people's committees were effectively forms of like government with a plan to become like the government of reunified Korea, and they were extremely effective in terms of their organization before, at least in South Korea, the US came a few weeks later, occupied South Korea, disbanded all the people's committees and oppressed the organizers that were doing it. But that level of success and organization comes not only from the decades of organizing that took place during that pre-revolutionary period, but also because those organizations were able to establish a deep trust with their people, right, with the masses, the working class, so that when the revolutionary moment comes, the masses and the people know who to turn to. And I think that's exactly what the task of all of us here in this room and all of us in organizations are. It is to establish that deep trust with the working class, the people of this country who will be the agents of change for revolution. So I just want to add that little piece there. But anyways, I want to thank our panelists, Betsy, Moe, and Brian. This plenary has examined the material conditions of the DPRK's socialist revolution to equip ourselves against imperialist lies that help justify the aggression against the DPRK. Among many ideas that were presented today, Betsy emphasized how the revolution is embedded in the everyday fabric of the DPRK's socialist society. Moe highlighted the changes as well as the persistence of international solidarity involving the DPRK and other revolutionary movements in Latin America and the non-aligned movement. And Brian offered us a very helpful historical overview as well as on the recent conditions surrounding escalating US and ROK aggression and the DPRK shift in its reunification policy. So just to remind us again, we started off this discussion with two learning objectives. One, preparing our movement to challenge US impunity in the event of escalation towards war in Korea. And two, winning the battle of ideas being manufactured against those building socialism. And just a reminder for y'all that the insights that we've gathered today from our panelists aren't just for our own individual consumption to be like, oh, now I know more about the DPRK. It's so that we can diligently integrate them into our political strategies, organizing tactics, and everyday interactions. I hope this session has activated all of you even more as revolutionary defenders of Korean socialism. To that end, I wanted to draw our audience's attention to further resources. All of our panelists touched upon how political education, mass political education, is an essential component of the objective of this plenary and our work. So on our website, our campaign website on usoutofkorea.org, in about a week or so, under the resources page, we're going to be launching a Korea education toolkit. So our Instagram, of course, thank you. Yeah, it's been a lot of work. The Instagram also offers a lot of helpful, tidbits. Share it with your friends. But this toolkit will be a list of accessible readings and films for you and your comrades to study more about Korean struggles. Revolutionary knowledge makes you even hungrier for more revolutionary knowledge. And as Betsy eloquently mentioned, we can't just imagine or think our way to liberation, right? We have to do the work. And so I hope and believe that all of us are inspired to escalate our work after the summit. So once again, please join me in thanking our panelists.